morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Ann Sullivan, and I am one of the co-chairs of the League of Women Voters of Illinois Mis and Disinformation Task Force. Tonight, we are fortunate to have Eric Schurenberg as our speaker. He is the founder of the Alliance for Trust in Media, a nonprofit organization dedicated to fostering trust between journalists and their audiences. The Alliance partners with newsrooms across the country to research strategies that help build audience trust and shares its findings at live events and through its website. It also promotes media literacy in the workplace and hosts the podcast In Reality, which focuses on truth, disinformation, and the media, which is our topic for this evening. Before founding the Alliance, Eric served as CEO of Mansueto Ventures, home of Inc. and Fast Company, where he led the company to its first year of profitability. Prior to that, he was president and editor-in-chief of Inc., founding editor at CBSMoneyWatch.com, and held several leadership roles in business journalism, earning numerous accolades, including a Loeb Award and a National Magazine Award. In addition to his work at the Alliance, Eric is editor-in-chief and board member of Amplify Publishing Group. He also serves as a strategic advisor to the University of Chicago's Leadership and Society Initiative and is a senior fellow at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Earlier in his career, Eric spent 6 years as an actor, often typecast as a Cockney juvenile delinquent, despite being from Ohio. And outside of work, Eric is a private pilot and a competitive club tennis player. So take it away, Eric. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anne. And thanks for bringing up the fact of my private pilothood. The joke about pilots is that you can always tell within 10 seconds whether you're talking to a pilot because he'll tell you. And I am pleased to be here. Let me just share the screen. All right. Are you seeing the first screen? And does that look like it should look?
Yes.
Okay, very good then. Before we get started, though, I want to tell you about an incredible thing that happened to me today. I got an email from a Nigerian prince. The poor guy was being pursued by rebels in his country, and so he had to get his money out of the country. And all I had to do to help him was to give him my banking information, and then he'd send his fortune to me for safekeeping. And when he was clear and safe, I could just give it back to him and keep $100,000 for my troubles. Now, can you believe my luck? Now, you all know that that's a joke, that we've all known for decades that this is a scam, and you don't open emails from people claiming to be Nigerian princes, or for that matter, claiming to be someone from PayPal saying your account has been compromised. Those people are out to steal your money by assuming fake identities. And in the same way, there are people out to steal your beliefs using fake stories, whether to sell your attention to advertisers or to sell you stuff directly like Alex Jones does, or to gain political power like many, many, many people are doing in this election season. Now, when online email scams like the Nigerian prince caper first appeared, it took some getting used to, but we cottoned on pretty quickly. News is a little trickier. But not having your beliefs hijacked is one of those skills that you have to learn if you want to operate successfully in the 21st century. So let's talk about our goals today. The first I would characterize is situational awareness. Let's better understand what's going on in the news ecosystem. If we can do that, then I'd consider this evening a success, and also to get better making your way through the chaos that is the news ecosystem these days and finding at the end the truth. That isn't as easy as it used to be. Now, whenever you think of the media, whatever comes to mind, whether it's traditional newsrooms like the New York Times or the Washington Post or talk radio or cable news or Joe Rogan podcasts or your crazy uncle on Facebook or Russian trolls on TikTok, whatever, all of it is part of this massive ecosystem. It's so sprawling, so contradictory, so full of hidden agendas that it's very hard to know what to believe. And to make it even harder, many players in the ecosystem, human and inhuman, know how to play on the all too human vulnerabilities and susceptibilities to fake news that we all share. You can't be a passive consumer of news in this environment and assume the truth is going to find you if you just keep scrolling, because it won't. So just a couple of assumptions going in, so we're all on the same page. I believe there is such a thing as objective truth, claims that describe the real world as best it can be known, regardless of who made the claim or who believes it. Let's also agree that there are sources that sincerely seek to find those truths, and you need to find the ones you can trust. You need them. For example, I believe that vaccines prevent disease, but not because I'm an epidemiologist and I've done the research, but because I trust sources that conveyed expert findings to that end, and I believe that the experts truly wanted to deliver life-saving medicine. And finally, let's agree that it's worth the effort to get at the truth. Democracy gives us the power to vote on the best direction for the country. And it's our responsibility to wield that power wisely for our sake and for that of our children. All by way of saying that getting to the facts is a 21st century skill that you need to master, just the same way that you need to master typing with your thumbs in the 21st century and not giving your money to some sympathetic Nigerian prince. So the information ecosystem is a hairball, let's face it. It's hard to get your arms around it, but one way to get started is by defining it as a marketplace with a supply side and a demand side. And let's start with the supply side, which includes all the people and all the institutions that supply information. So here's a graph from Statista that defines the information ecosystem on the supply side with these 8 multi-bar clusters. Each multi-bar cluster represents a category of news-bearing organizations. Well, and each of the individual bars, by the way, represents how popular that news category is with different age groups. When I got started in the media business, there were just 4 of these clusters: local and national news, broadcast news, and local televised news and radio, maybe. Now there are twice as many. And you can see there's quite a difference in who watches which. People over 65 are still very much attuned to broadcast news. People at 18 years, not so much. And then exactly the opposite when it comes to social media. What this doesn't show, of course, is how many content creators reside within each of these clusters. So just to take an example, let's say that there are, I'm guessing, 1,500 radio stations pumping out content on radio. Well, there are 3 billion Facebook users all posting content every month. These are volumes that are just hard to even conceive. There are 300,000 hours of YouTube videos uploaded every hour, 900,000 hours of TikTok videos uploaded every hour of every day. And so in this environment, the media ecosystem basically exploded into thousands and millions of individual sources of information. Many are tiny, like your crazy uncle on X, but some are large enough to compete with mainstream media, where professional journalism is practiced. So Alex Cooper, there on the left, who recently hosted Kamala Harris on her podcast, has nearly 4 million followers just on TikTok. Ben Shapiro, a conservative lawyer turned political commentator, has 6 million followers on X, and that's not counting his podcast. And Mr. Beast, an entertainer on YouTube, has 250 million followers on YouTube, which is roughly the adult population of the entire US. Note that none of these people are trained journalists. Now, this new, incredibly fragmented information ecosystem couldn't exist without a business model, and it's captured in this chart. So let's say you're scrolling through your phone on Instagram and you come across an Apple Watch ad. Now you might reasonably think that, oh, Apple bought an ad on Instagram. And that's what it looks like. And 25 years ago, that's probably what would have happened. That visible ad exchange is what is on this chart above the dotted line. But in reality, that's probably not what happened. What happened instead is that as you were scrolling to this place on Instagram, a signal went out to an ad exchange saying, someone like you is about to see an ad. What am I bid for that person's attention? And all of a sudden, an online auction takes place behind the scenes. And in this auction, in this example, Apple won. And so they got to serve up the ad to you. All of this happens in fractions of a second. You don't even perceive it. What doesn't happen is that Apple knows where the ad is appearing. Is it the Instagram reel of a New York Times reporter or a friend of yours? A conspiracy nut, an anti-vaxxer, an ISIS recruiter? All of them can make money in this business as long as they can attract eyeballs under this business model. The ad tech market doesn't care who they are, just cares even less whether they're telling the truth. The effect of all this on journalism has been basically cataclysmic. So 5 of every $8 spent on digital advertising in recent years goes to organizations like Meta and Alphabet, Amazon, and TikTok that aren't publishers at all. After all, they have the biggest audiences. They know more about their users than anyone, so the ad targeting is better. But it means that hundreds of thousands of other online sites, including every news site, is left scrambling for the table scraps. And that's not sustainable. Local news has been hardest hit. We're losing about 200 local newspapers every month. And even the newsrooms that are left are hollowed out. What other business has lost more than half its workforce in the past 15 years? And when you create this kind of vacuum in an industry, it has to be filled. So let's talk about what fills it. First, there's more fake news. Because of this programmatic advertising model, you get this kind of death spiral of traditional media. The social media platforms create this explosion of new content sources that have no content creation costs or distribution costs. The advertising model that feeds them prioritizes outrage. And one target of the outrage is mainstream media itself, because that's the major competitor. So as ad dollars flock to this new alternative, newsrooms have to cut costs, leaving more people to flock to the platforms, and we go around the horn once again. Now, one group of actors in the current ecosystem is well aware of how to use this news environment. That's state propagandists, especially in Russia, who see the US election as a great opportunity to sow chaos. So here is a video reported by the great reporter for NBC, Brandy Zadrozhny. Let's see what she had to say.
Late last year, this strange, and let's just say from the outset, false story started going around about Ukraine's Vladimir Zelensky.
Ukrainian President Zelensky somehow managed to buy 2 multi-million-dollar yachts.
Now, to be clear, nothing about the U.S. aid for yachts story was true. What was true? Vladimir Zelensky is the president of Ukraine. That checks out. And there is an ongoing debate about U.S. financial support for Ukraine. But there are a lot of these phony stories. NBC News has followed more than 40 over the last year. Clint Watts is an NBC News contributor. You've likely seen him in our coverage when there's big breaking stories. He's also the head of Microsoft's Threat Intelligence Center. Stories like these, Clint says, come straight through a pipeline, straight from Moscow, via something called Storm 1516.
Storm 1516 is what you would think of for the old troll farm, the Internet Research Agency 10 years later, in that they need to adapt to a new medium, which is video, and they need to come up with a way to make disinformation.
Think of Storm 1516 almost like a disinformation production company. They follow a reliable path, one that starts with a cheaply made video.
Hey guys, my name is Olesha. and I'm a former employee of the so-called Troll Fabric.
I'm a senior associate scientist at the Pfizer facility in Kiev.
My name is Shahzad Nasser. I'm here to share an interesting discovery of mine.
The videos usually don't stay online long. They don't have to. They are just the kernels of so-called evidence in the pipeline.
According to this agreement I have managed to acquire, the yacht was referred to as Zelensky's yacht.
In this video, this isn't an actual journalist. His bio is faked, his true identity unknown, but his story is repackaged and amplified through the next part of the disinformation pipeline.
They then take those videos and they launder it through Telegram,
Telegram is a social media site popular with people kind of on the fringe.
but also through a series of websites that are made to look like local news sites.
The stories on those sites are shared on social media, first by known Russian propagandists, but then, if the plan works, by a US audience. In this case, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene sharing the story with her 3.7 million followers. Her office didn't respond to our multiple requests for comment. The pipeline that began in Russia, now practically flooding American voters with disinformation. And here's the thing, these videos that kick it all off, they're not even that sophisticated. Darren Linville, director of Clemson's Media Forensics Hub, says they don't have to be.
More than half, I would say, almost completely fail. But it doesn't matter because they're so cheap to do that you only need a few of them to hit to make it entirely worthwhile. And they've had more than a few hits.
These videos are now targeting US voters, trying to conflate fact and fiction and create havoc heading into the election.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.
Late last year, this...
Well, that was an unpaid commercial for NBC. Let me note that a couple of things about that. One is that those fake news sites that Brandy referred to are called pink slime. They're all across the US, and they're often created and owned by right-wing, sometimes left-wing organizations masquerading as local news sites, but really only not delivering local news, but instead delivering talking points for that particular political party. And of course, misinformation entering that cycle of starting at the fringes on Telegram or Gab or Parler or even X don't have to originate in a Russian troll farm. They can start on a Facebook post of a Springfield, Ohio person who can note that her daughter's friend of a friend lost their cat and she blames the Haitians. What matters is who picks it up. And in this case, that small story got retailed to 70 million people in the presidential debate. So fake news is one of the problems that has arisen out of the remaking of the information ecosystem. Another one is a surfeit of opinion. Now, has anyone here ever thought that just what you wanted was someone to give you just the news, just the facts? Well, if you feel that there's more editorializing in traditional news sources, it's not your imagination. As newsrooms lose staff, they still have to generate content, and hiring a pundit to comment on news someone else reports is a lot cheaper than sending your own reporters to Ukraine or Gaza. And here's the data behind that impression. So in 1955, what you see in this graph is that about 85% of the stories on the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post were straight news. By 2020, that number had dropped to 47%. The rest were opinion or analysis or something else. So as you try to make sense of the news that you're getting from your feed, you need to ask not just, is this real? Is it coming from a reliable source? But also, is this news? Is it opinion? Is it analysis? And there's nothing wrong with analysis or opinion, but you need to know what it is. And newsrooms that have integrity will flag that information for you, very obviously. If they don't, that's a sign that the news site is not trustworthy. I'm going to zoom through this little quiz about what news and opinion are. I think you could probably figure that out yourself. So let's talk about the final and maybe the most disturbing effect of the dysfunction in the media ecosystem, which is more polarization. Outrage and fear drive traffic, as we said before, and a great way to stoke those emotions is to polarize, to demonize people who are not part of your tribe. Mainstream media is not exempt from this temptation either. So this graph shows the amount of coverage that members of the House and Senate received from the New York Times based on how extreme their statements were, either left or right. So that's a House of Representatives on the left, the Senate on the right. The most extreme voices in the House received 3 times as much coverage from the Times as moderates. In other words, if you want to scare Democrats and get them to click on your story, write about Marjorie Taylor Greene. And if you want to do the same for Republicans, write about AOC. The result is that the US in our media landscape is more polarized than that of other liberal democracies like the UK or Germany. Now, what this graph shows in this middle vertical axis, that represents the average political opinion in the nation. And the horizontal axis represents a kind of string along the far left, the far right, where major news sites rank in that political spectrum. And you can see in the US, most of the mainstream sites are to the left of the center. The size of those bubbles, by the way, represents how big the circulation and audience is for those particular sites. It's a different story in the UK and Germany, where the major news sites are clustered much closer to the middle, and that's where the bulk of the audience actually is. One difference about those two countries is that they have nonpartisan government-supported media outlets. One of the things about our polarized news environment is that you don't necessarily know what you're missing, that you may be living in a different bubble, and the news, you don't even know what news your neighbors are reading. So here are 4 headlines drawn from Ground News, which is a Canadian-based news aggregator that collects news from around the world by topic, and then rates the news source covering that story by political leaning and by its adherence to factuality. So you can see how many news sites, for example, on the left side of the political spectrum covered a particular story versus on the right. And here are 4 recent stories and sort of what polarized media has meant to our filter bubbles. The first story is about the unveiling of more of Jack Smith's files in the election interference case that he's bringing before Judge Chukan. This story was reported 47 times, according to Ground News. Only 5 of those news organizations leaned right. Another story in which Trump supposedly asked Murdoch to kill ads negative to Trump. This was reported 8 times, only once by a right-leaning organization. On the other side of the spectrum, a story that was gleefully reported by many right-leaning organizations was a story about a woman who tore down Greek flags outside a Greek restaurant thinking they were Israeli flags. 38 articles, only 1 lean left. And finally, a story about how Americans feel compared to 4 years ago, which was not good news for the Biden-Harris administration, reported 23 times, only once by a left-leaning organization. Now let's move on to the demand side, which is all of us. One reason that fake news thrives in this environment is that, for better or for worse, perhaps, we gravitate towards it. Now, if you think that you have a good spidey sense for what is a fake news headline and what's real, why don't you take a look at this test? These are all real news stories. Some of them are quotes from the political candidates. Others are headlines drawn from a variety of news sources. First one, Kamala Harris said we've cut the flow of fentanyl by half. Did she? And the second headline, Trump claimed that the Biden administration stole $1 billion from FEMA to use to support illegal immigrants. Is that true? A social media headline claimed that FEMA closed a South Carolina runway to prevent supplies from reaching hurricane victims. Did it? Trump, I think, claimed that Waltz signed, or Vance, I think, claimed that Waltz signed bills that would allow illegal migrants to apply for licenses and scholarships in Minnesota. Is that true? Brett Baier, on the Fox interview with Kamala Harris, claimed that the immigration bill she approved would have let 1.8 million illegal immigrants into the country. Was he right? A social media headline claimed that Wisconsin allows illegal immigrants to get free voter IDs. Is that true? And finally, Harris claimed that 16 Nobel Prize winners said that her economic plan was, in her words, vastly superior to Trump's. Was she right? As it turned out, only 2 of those claims was true. The one about Waltz's bill in Minnesota and Harris's claim about Nobel laureates. Now, how well you did on this test probably depends on how closely you've been following the news, of course, but also on how willing you were to admit that your team sometimes stretches the truth. Here's why it's so hard to get around to discerning fake news from real news. Psychologists have identified all of these and a battery of other mental shortcuts and tendencies that we have that make us susceptible to false narratives. We can run through them all, but you get the picture, and I think you've probably heard this before. Stress is one reason that lies are so common during wars or during natural disasters. People aren't thinking clearly and they are desperate for answers. Confirmation bias. It's exhausting to constantly challenge what you think you know, so you look for evidence that confirms what you believe and you tend to discount the rest, and so on. So what are you going to do to make yourself a harder mark, a more literate consumer of the news between now and the election and beyond that? Now, my favorite answer, because it's so useful and so memorable, is developed by a researcher named Mike Caulfield in Washington. It's called the SIFT method. The acronym is easy to remember: stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, and trace the claim back. Let's test this on a real claim that garnered 1.3 million views on TikTok, on Twitter rather, a few months ago.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I hope that you are doing well today. The reason I bring up this little green screen is because a little bird told me to look into this, a friend of mine. And I wanted to bring it to your attention. So as we know, they've been shipping a lot of illegal people all over the country, and they're bringing them into Wisconsin. Now, this says free ID for voting. Get an ID for voting, even if you do not have the documentation to get a regular Wisconsin ID. This is on Wisconsin.'s website, okay? I'm gonna show you something else. Let's really look at number 3 here. If you don't have all or any of these, you can still get an ID for voting. I'm willing to bet that the blue people are giving them hunties to vote blue. If this isn't election interference that's going on in the United States right now, and this is one state, you can look this up, honey, Wisconsin.com. I don't know what is. I don't know what is. Wake up.
Now, I think that obviously this is very misleading information, and I don't want you to think that I totally have my thumb on the scale just because this doesn't look like a real newsroom. For the fact is, for many younger and mistrustful viewers, this kind of news delivery is more authentic than someone speaking in a newsroom on an NBC studio or a newsroom at the Washington Post. So let's go through the SIFT methodology. If you're concerned about migrants voting illegally in a swing state like Wisconsin, maybe this claim could make you angry or at least worried. After all, he's got documentation and it checks out on the wisconsin.gov site. So stop and chill and don't let yourself be manipulated. Ask yourself, what is it that you're looking at? Is it news, analysis, opinion, or just kind of yop, just performance? Well, this sort of looked like news because it was claiming to relate a fact, but it made some remarkable leaps of faith. There was this card on or this section of the Wisconsin.gov site, but there was no evidence to back up the idea that there was an international plot to interfere with the election and bring illegal voters into Wisconsin, where, as in every state, it's illegal for non-citizens to vote. Look at the context too. So your knowledge of it, maybe you don't know much about what voting rights are in Wisconsin. I don't, so that's kind of irrelevant. What's the creator's intent here? And what's the political atmosphere? Wall Street Apes, which owned this site, is a conservative site. Everybody knows that election interference is a major concern of conservatives in this election season. So arguably, it's not outside the realm of possibility that this creator was looking to gain points with a conservative audience by playing to a belief that they already had. And finally, the friction cost. The psychologist Dan Ariely talks about friction as being a key to whether a claim is trustworthy or not. By friction, he means what did it take to make this claim? So, for example, a 3-month investigation by ProPublica has higher friction costs than a post on X, where the reporting was done by the creator's anonymous friend. Or another kind of friction would be a claim by, say, Lynn Cheney that she won't vote for Trump. That has higher friction costs for her than, say, Chuck Schumer saying the same thing because it costs her her party's support. Moving on to the other parts of the SIFT acronym, the outlet of Wall Street Apes, as we said, is right-leaning. It doesn't have a high factuality record. You can find this on a number of sites, including All Sides and Ad Fontes. You can look elsewhere to see if there are other complaints in Wisconsin reporting about illegal migrants or undocumented people voting, and there are no other stories. Same way with better coverage, you could go to, as a matter of fact, this is covered in Snopes.com, which explains that this element on the Wisconsin site is pretty harmless and has a very innocent explanation. And if you weren't satisfied by that, you could go to the original source. Often, especially with memes, they're built around an image that is taken out of context or is fake. You can do a reverse image search on Google and find out where that thing originated. Anyway, you get the picture behind SIFT. Ultimately, what you want to achieve is what the researchers call mental immunity, so that you don't have to go through quite so much work on every claim that enters your newsfeed. There are 2 parts to this. One is situational awareness, just to recognize the ways that people will try to manipulate you by playing on your emotions or creating false dichotomies or conflating correlation and causation or finding patterns that aren't there or repeating false claims until they just seem to be true by virtue of mere repetition. And finally, all of the attributes that create mental immunity, the most important of them all, is a practice that psychologists call actively open-minded thinking, AOT. That means the deliberate cultivation of an approach to evidence that is unbiased before you make a decision or form an opinion. So bear with me on this not very clear chart, but what it shows is that basically what it does is it compares AOT with 4 psychological states and rates them by their veracity discernment ability, or their correlation with veracity discernment ability, or people's ability to detect false news. VDA for veracity discernment ability. Now, the way to interpret it is that numeracy skills, that number, the second from the top, which is a familiarity with numbers, is only loosely correlated with the ability to detect false information. Surprisingly, cognitive reflection test performance, which is the tendency to think things through before jumping to conclusions, that's even less correlated with VDA. And all of them pale in comparison to actively open-minded thinking. So look, if you take nothing away from this, remember these 3 steps. When you're confronted with dubious claims or any claim, especially one that fires up your emotions, take yourself out of the equation. Stop and think. Your emotional reaction to a claim makes it more memorable, it's more effective, more powerful, but it doesn't make it true. And if you feel your temperature rising when someone shares a headline with you, stop. Don't share it until you've had a chance to understand the context, the intent of the writer, the political environment, and note the friction costs. Second, get a second opinion. Daniel Kahneman, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, points out that many, many errors of judgment stem from what he calls, by the acronym, WYSIATI. What you see is all there is. The headline in front of you is not all the evidence there is. So see who else is reporting on the claim and what they're saying. And finally, and this is the most significant one of all, the golden rule, cultivate actively open-minded thinking. Get out of your filter bubble, get other perspectives. Every institution that sincerely tries to get at the truth has embedded in its culture some system, some mechanism for challenging claims. In science, it's the peer review or the replication of experimental results. In journalism, it's fact-checking or the editor's role in the newsroom. In law, it's the adversarial system, cross-examination, rules of evidence. In the US Constitution, it's checks and balances. And in the end, the ultimate check and balance, which is the vote. And the vote is effective only if people like us have a way of getting to the truth. The vote is a privilege conferred by the Constitution, refined and expanded over centuries of improvement. Getting truthful information is a lot harder than it was when the founders wrote the Constitution, but the responsibility to get to the truth is still the same. I hope we take it seriously and that this conversation made it just a little bit easier. And let me just put up one slide about me and the Alliance for Trust in Media, which is my not-for-profit that Anne described earlier on. Please write down that website and find me on my podcast, In Reality. And let me stop sharing the screen and let's.
Thank you so much, Eric. Can you tell us more while you're taking down your screen share? Can you tell us a little bit more about the Alliance for Trust in the Media?
Well, thank you. Thank you. So the Alliance for Trust in Media has 2 basic goals. We have a research goal. We work with newsrooms to help them, fund them, do the research around experiments they're doing to build trust with their audience or build out a new relation with audiences that are inclined to be mistrustful. And one example would be the work we're doing right now with Chicago Public Media to help them reach audiences in Chicago's fast-growing migrant community over platforms that are not traditional, but are favored by that community, like WhatsApp and texting. In Texas, we're working with the Texas Tribune to create what we call radical transparency. So in this experiment, someone in the newsroom is responsible for fielding incoming concerns from the Texas audience, especially from a panel of rural, skeptical Texans who are inclined not to trust traditional news from the blue bubble of Austin, Texas. And basically, the idea here is that by responding respectfully and fully to these complaints, we may not make converts to the Democratic Party. That's not necessarily the goal anyway of the Texas Tribune, but can build a level of trust that otherwise wouldn't exist. And the other thing we do is teach media literacy to grown-ups through universities like the University of Chicago, where I'm teaching a class on this very topic, organizations like this, and through companies where the leadership is concerned that their workers have practice critical thinking skills and don't go down rabbit holes, to build team cohesion, to have everybody on the same page about what's real. So thank you for asking.
So fascinating, because we all see that disinformation and distrust is just growing in our society. And as Dawn asked in the chat, how do we ever put this genie back in the bottle? How do we ever get back to a place where we can trust what we read? And is it our lifestyle? What do you see that's going to happen to bring it back and put it back in the bottle?
I'm not sure you can get the genie back in the bottle or the toothpaste back in the tube. And so one of two things could happen. One is that we continue along this path and we just get better at discerning what is truthful information out there. We did not get phishing, interference on our email from Nigerian princes before we had email, but the technology brought that particular risk to us and we learned to cope with it. And it may be that we just learned to cope with misinformation by polishing tools like the SIFT method, or by creating our own trusted collection of news sources that we know give it to us straight. The other thing that might happen is that after things get worse than now, after things get really bad, after AI begins to take things down a new and darker path, we start to default to very few trusted, reliable sources. The explosion of information sources starts to collapse on itself, and we start to believe only in a handful of media brands, some of which we can probably name now, because we know that they have integrity, and we just disregard the rest.
So what role do you think these 24-hour perpetual news stations like MSNBC and Fox, that rise of really of 24-hour opinion stations, right? What has that added to the mis and disinformation landscape, do you think?
Well, I would say that I would characterize those as entertainment stations, not necessarily news stations. They are kind of unrelenting opinion, particularly on Fox, with just a few exceptions. And their grounding in reality is tenuous, as we learned from the Dominion Voting Systems lawsuit against Fox, where we saw that some of those anchors were deliberately allowing false information to go on their air, knowing it was false. I think it's perfectly fine if news, or rather this kind of entertainment and opinion information is out there, as long as you know what it is, as long as they come clean with what it is they're doing. And Fox, to its credit, identifies itself as the conservative voice. It was a little shakier, I would say, when they were calling themselves Fair and Balanced, but they have released that moniker. So if you know what you're looking at, if you know that a site is conservative or liberal, and you're able to take that into account in making your mind up about whether you should trust it or not, I think that's fair enough. Neither side has a monopoly on the truth, and I think part of the art of cultivating actively open-minded thinking is seeking out sources that don't agree with you, that have opinions that are different from yours, but are trustworthy and that you can tolerate.
Do you think that legislative action on reestablishment of the fairness doctrine or any sort of government action could help moderate some of this?
I think that where regulation is really needed is in the social media space. And there, I think we have just let this technology do too much harm without any kind of guardrails put around it. And those harms are well known. The depression among teenagers, body dysmorphia, as well as misinformation that led to undermining some of the institutions that are essential to democracy. And I think that where that may come, where regulation may come, is in that field. And it also may come in the form not of censorship, like we are going to set up a kind of panel to decide what is true and what isn't, but more in the realm of consumer protection, that the content on this site is actually harmful to people, and that needs to be corrected. And the government has an interest in stepping in on behalf of its citizens in that regard. What I don't believe will stand the test of time is the claim that these platforms are neutral sources of news and they don't stand in the way. All of them are algorithmically driven. All of them prioritize particular kinds of posts. The more profit-focused ones prioritize the kind of information that gets the most engagement, which tends to be outrage or polarizing. Some of them prioritize a political point of view. But in every case, it seems to me that that algorithm interceding between the viewer of a post and the creator of the post makes it a publisher.
So these citizen journalists, or as they're called, of reporting news that they hear or saw or whatever, there's no fact checking done by these social media sites. And so therefore it just explodes through algorithms. Can you do a basic algorithm 101 understanding of how it works and how we end up living in filter bubbles and silos?
Sure. So algorithm 101 is an algorithm is just mathematics. And it is the way that these sites decide what to show you. The algorithms are optimized to keep you on the site. So when you enroll on X or Facebook or anything, the site is constantly observing what you like, what you click on, how much time you spend on it, what you share, what you give a thumbs up to, what you comment on. And all that goes into a probability algorithm that says this person likes stories about baseball and cute cat pictures. And so we're going to serve up more and more of that. And then it will also test other things and see your reaction to things that might be more political in nature or more newsy in nature, and see how those sit with you and how you react and how long you spend on the site. This is totally amoral. There's no effort to do anything except keep you on the site in most cases. Now, there are some fringe small sites that try to optimize our algorithms for more pro-social purposes, but they don't have very much traffic, and you can see why. You want to be on a site where all your friends are. The social media network effect is extremely powerful and probably impossible to overcome at this stage.
So that then feeds into the illusionary truth effect, right? Because the more I see the false claims, the more I click on them, the longer I spend with them, the more I see. And so therefore, the more I believe, because it's everywhere, right? I saw it on multiple.
Yes. And the thing about the illusory truth effect, so we're seeing it, I mean, the most present one right now is the big lie about the 2020 election. But the thing about the illusory truth effect is that it works, even if the claim is implausible on its face. So there have been studies that show the difference between people's ability to discern false information from true information, depending on whether they saw that they were exposed to the information once or repeatedly. And you see that even if the information is just kind of hard to believe, the more it's repeated, the more truthful it seems. This is not a matter of people being lazy or gullible. It is simply the way our brains are wired.
So, as someone asked the question in the chat about those are the people who don't seem motivated to reality, right? They don't check what they read. How do we break through to those people and get them to use the SIFT method or media literacy skills?
I think that it's very hard to, and obviously for obvious reasons, very hard to unburden someone of a false belief that they've held for a long time, especially if it's one that is tied up with their vision of themselves, their identity. And this is true of a lot of politics these days. But at the same time, I think people want to know what's true. Nobody wants to be fooled. And so you can start, I think, with, from a point in the present and try to get people to develop the skills like AOT and other kinds of discernment and understanding how they get manipulated. A powerful element in this is called pre-bunking. So if you tell people ahead of time that you're about to hear false information about migrants, this actually was an experiment done in Eastern Europe. Google shared millions of ads in Poland and Czechoslovakia saying that you're about to hear a lot of lies about migrants coming from Ukraine, that they're criminals and dirty and all these other things that are pretty familiar to us who've listened to some of the debate in this country about migrants over the southern border. And those are not true. And the research found that people who were exposed to that pre-bunking were less likely to believe the false information when, sure enough, it started to show up. So whatever your thoughts were about, if you're a Pole, whatever your thoughts were about Ukrainians, when someone told you ahead of time that you're going to be fooled if you believe that they're criminals or dirty, or whatever the claims were, you're not going to believe it.
Or at least question it.
You're going to question it. And I think, core to people's identity, even more than their political beliefs, is their belief that they know what's what, and that they don't want to be anybody's fool.
Is there a oh, well, I do want to get back to this one question. Someone asks if you could provide the sources for the ad buy portion early in your presentation.
Oh, that description of how the ad tech market works?
Right.
Yes. And if you'd like, I'd certainly happy to let you keep these slides for the league if you like.
Oh, lovely.
And this, let's see. The chart is one that I created myself, adapting it from a source. I'll find the source and email it to you. I don't have it on the slide, and at the moment I don't remember.
Oh,
but this is a fairly it's a fairly standard schematic of how the ad tech market works.
You interviewed on one of your podcasts the original fact checker, and I'm just wondering if you could share some of his thoughts that he shared with us about how did he become a fact checker and how did that whole process start? Did it start when we were posed with the idea of alternative facts?
It came before the internet became what it was and before false news became what it was. You're talking about Glenn Kessler of the Washington Post.
Yes.
And he was fact-checking one of the campaigns of early in recent memory. And I don't remember now whether it was Clinton or George W. Bush, but it was then, and he began to sort of fact check the claims that were being made during the campaign, and it became so popular that it just became a regular feature. One thing that was interesting in that interview that I found particularly memorable is that I asked him about the controversy over the 2020 election and what was the one argument that he used to convince people that the 2020 election was fair and not stolen. And he said that for him, the most conclusive and easiest to explain explanation was that the down ballots supported Republicans. So if the Democrats were so conniving and clever that they could alter presidential votes inside the machine or using Venezuelan software or whatever some of the more outlandish claims are, stuffing ballot boxes, why did they leave Republicans in charge of Congress?
You have to wonder why people didn't ask themselves that question, I guess.
I think that the answer lies in one of those psychological shortcuts that we all use of confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. If your identity is so tied up with being on the MAGA side of the political debate, you will find convincing evidence where other people would not, and you'll ignore evidence that other people find conclusive. And I wish it weren't so. And I think that it's only fair to say that we're all prone to that kind of
And on the other side,
mental lapse.
yes.
So, but that claim has been, I mean, as we all know here, particularly destructive, and it's quite worrisome because it hasn't gone away, and we have another election coming up in 2 weeks.
I guess my last question for you is that what role has the news deserts, the decline of newspapers, and the source of local news? We all trusted our local community newspaper that have since disappeared over the years. How much do you feel that has contributed to dis and misinformation as we see the replacement with pink slime in other places, other pieces of literature that we receive?
I think it's a major factor, and it's hard to imagine that misinformation would have taken such hold if we had a vibrant local news ecosystem. What happens in places where the local news goes away, you have a void in which misinformation floods, either in the case of pink slime, fake news sites, or in existing news sites being taken over by private equity firms or politically polarized news umbrella organizations. And then the news kind of becomes national because those sites repeat national news talking points. And so weirdly, the vote about your state legislator or the comptroller of the state legislature or the mayor becomes about Trump or Harris. And this is only further polarizing. There's another equally alarming factor that crops up when local news goes away, is that there is more government waste and more corruption. In Texas, the state legislators refer to it as the Tribune effect. Before there was the Texas Tribune to keep an eye on the state legislature, legislators could say whatever they wanted, and no one was holding them to account. And there is data that shows that where local news has gone away, there is more corruption, more spending, less gets done. This is kind of the watchdog role that the founders envisioned. when they created the First Amendment. And unfortunately, because of the change in the business model, the rise of the platforms, the collapse of the local business model and local advertising markets, those necessary institutions just often can't survive.
And leave the void then for people searching out their news on social media, Nextdoor, or all those markets that are
Yeah.
places of mis and disinformation also.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Eric. I'm going to turn the meeting back over to Anne. This has been so insightful and educational, and I encourage everyone to go to the Alliance for Trust in Media website and see some of the fantastic interviews that Eric has done there. So, Anne,
Yes, so I would also like to encourage everybody, if you haven't already, to visit our Mis and Disinformation webpage on the League of Women Voters of Illinois website. That's lwvil.org/misdis-info. And maybe Barb can put that in the chat. We have a variety of programs that we've been doing since back in March with excellent speakers like Eric, and we are recording this evening's presentation as well, and we'll have that up in a few days. I can't promise exactly how many days, but it will be up there. And then in late November, we're hoping to do another program with a speaker from the Brennan Center for Justice, talking about election law and disinformation and some of the things that Eric alluded to as far as the regulation of social media and what is the path forward here. So I hope that you will be on the lookout for that and that you'll be able to join us for that presentation as well. And Eric, this was just so great to talk to you. Thank you so much for sharing all this great information with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.